Hey everybody, it's Tom, and I'm coming to you today with, I think, the sixth installation, if you like, of our efforts to begin approaching definitions to crucial terms in the public conversation. And the word that we're going to be taking up today, shift up there, is science, which plays an enormous role in how all sorts of issues are shaped in our public discourse, even those which may not obviously relate to science. And we alluded to this somewhat in the video on race. Oftentimes scientific vocabulary is invoked to conceal the operation of political or social agenda behind a veneer of what could be termed objectivity. And this is precisely the kind of confusion which I think we need to work to really resist. And so that being said, let's turn to the question of what is science. And it's invoked, I would say, really in a twofold fashion. It's a really crucial distinction. On one hand, science is a methodology. It is a way of going out into the world, interfacing with that world in a systematic fashion with an eye to trying to elicit what order potentially operates behind, if you like, the surface of appearances. What is the principle which grants coherence to reality? But it's a method. It's not it's a method of undertaking that investigation. It's not a conclusion. It's a method which is formally inaugurated, as most people know, as I'm sure all of you know, in the say 16th century, maybe anticipations of the 15th century. If you were going to situate it with a singular individual, a singular set of individuals, candidates come up such as Galileo or Descartes. Descartes probably really gives us the first really systematic account of a scientific method, though he has some debt to Francis Bacon, who also did work in that connection. The Galilean contribution is to suggest that what the language of nature is mathematical, the mathematicization of nature. And that's really what drives the trajectory of scientific development over the centuries which have unfolded since the inauguration of the scientific revolution, as it's often called. But oftentimes, the word science is not used with reference to the methodology, which I've already noted, implicit in that methodology are certain presuppositions about reality, right? The presuppositions are that reality has some kind of systematic or coherent grounding, which would be necessary if the quest or the investigation which it represents is going to have any fruit. Person who put this very adeptly was a guy by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. But to stay within the confines of just talking about the definition, science as a methodology, any methodology actually carries into it certain presumptions. And we're going to return to that point in a moment. But what I was about to say is that often, rather than being used in reference to a methodology, science is used to refer to a certain body of theoretical constructs and conclusions which are held widely within, let us say, the scientific community. The scientific community being people who are professionally engaged in the practice of the methodology to which we've already referred. And as I'm sort of recording that video at this time, the body of theoretical constructs which are identified as scientific include things such as what is oftentimes you say, oh, Darwinism or the theory of evolution. But when you look into the literature, it's slightly more refined. They call it, oftentimes, for example, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which takes the findings of Mendelian genetics or genetics and marries or attempts to integrate the findings of genetics with the hypotheses of Charles Darwin. They actually, are independently formulated trajectories, because the Darwinian account often is largely macroscopic, whereas obviously the genetic account is microscopic, microphysiological, as opposed to macrophysiological. But they are synthesized and presumed to represent an objective account. Also, we have things like the general theory of relativity. And then you have things like quantum mechanics, which are, the quantum world is so bizarre that multiple and competing interpretations are still, going at it with each other. So there isn't an emergent or singular consensus. These are all examples of theories, and they're all quite legitimate theories within their own bounds. The problem arises when it's believed that in virtue of that, those theories were often reached by the avenue of the scientific method. They have a kind of almost sacrosanct quality to them. And that's problematic on multiple levels, not the least of which is that it actually violates the principle of scientific investigation itself, which precludes accepting any conclusion as ultimately final. This is a direct consequence of that the scientific method relies heavily on induction rather than deduction. And inductive reasoning never has the certitude of deductive reasoning because it's open-ended, right? Just because you've flipped a coin and it's landed on its head 50 times doesn't mean that the next time it's going to turn up heads. Just because the sun has come up every day of your life doesn't mean it's going to come up tomorrow. These are sort of gross examples to illustrate, but it's pretty apparent quickly why induction can never grant us absolute certitude, and why, as a result, theories which are grounded on inductive reasoning always will retain a tentative or proximate character. This is often sort of suppressed. Lip service is given to that point, but it's not fully appreciated. And an aura of objectivity, again, is presupposed to be associated with these constructs that I mentioned. And this is incredibly dangerous, then, not just because it can give rise to protection of a potentially inadequate or false theory, as has happened historically in multiple cases. Most obvious parade example would be the successive theories of how the solar system was composed. In fact, the Ptolemaic framework, which is refined by Copernicus and then in turn refined further by people like Kepler and so forth, the Ptolemaic framework is not de facto unscientific. It's a hypothesis. And the Copernican framework, which wished to retain a commitment to orbits being purely circular and needing as a result the introduction of devices they called epicycles, orbits within orbits, to account for the deviation of planetary and celestial course from the expectation of circularity. These are all, these were subsequently inadequate theories. But that does not mean that they were unscientific. So we come, for example, to the theory of evolution. And a lot of times people hold that to disagree with the theory of evolution is probably to do so from a position which reflects certain theological commitments, which is lamentable, and it's lamentable for two reasons here. Number one, there's serious structural defects of the theory of evolution that have nothing to do with theology. The most serious, in my view, is that it wants to posit that the mechanism of natural selection, which is a real phenomenon, it happens, I'm not denying that, but it wants to take this singular phenomenon and use it to do far more explanatory work than of which it is actually capable. It's because the mechanism of natural selection is, to use is fundamentally stochastical or statistical in its operation. It basically says if you have a long enough time, the interaction of random events will give rise to this coherence that we encounter in the universe, and which finds especially interesting expression in life and complexity. Now, there are other sort of finer grained problems, like, it doesn't really do a good job of explaining how you can get new species, and it doesn't really know how to explain life itself. So these are definite problems in the theory of evolution that don't have anything to do with a person's theological commitments. But you rarely hear discussion of that because of the problem that we want to render it an objective theory. And similar issues can be raised with reference to other issues as well. Even something like general relativity is not beyond questioning. However, the reason I'm putting such emphasis on the theory of evolution is because that biological schema really is invoked to justify some really nasty things. This is more clear historically with things like eugenics, which was often used to justify things like racism, or it's been used to justify certain sexist or patriarchal motifs. And it's also used to justify the oppression of the poor through a kind of bioreductionism. And it takes other forms as well. So coming back then to the root of the video, what is science? I think, we have to remember the word is kind of polyvalent. It has multiple references. The most legitimate are science as a form of methodology, and then we can use it to denote a certain body of consensuses or theoretical constructs which are entertained by the scientific community or even by society at large. But when we fail to appreciate the sort of tentative quality of those constructs, that's when we get into trouble, and the use of the word becomes problematic and may perhaps be more then you get into the domain which is sometimes alluded to as the pseudoscientific, which is, or you could say that phenomenon is scientism, where people think that science is all the answers, and science itself doesn't pretend to have all the answers. That's something that we impose upon it for all sorts of reasons. So I've hashed out these distinctions, and I'm going to wrap it up a little bit quickly here. Tomorrow we're going to take up the related question of religion. It's not necessarily structurally related, but it's certainly historically and culturally related. And I just want to have those sort of gradations in place in your mind when we take that up tomorrow. All right, so that's been Tom today. Some thoughts on science. Thank you guys for listening, and I will see you on the morrow.